Luther Martin, the Anti-Federalist firebrand, predicted that the Constitution would lead to a national system of government with all kinds of consolidated and centralized power, and it absolutely would fail to preserve and secure the liberties of the people. And on top of it, he made the case that this was basically an intentional conspiracy, a deliberate plan at the Philadelphia Convention, where he was a very active delegate. And he said it was a deliberate plan to undermine federalism and state sovereignty. So in this episode, we're going to uncover some of Luther Martin's top fiery anti-federalist objections to ratification of the Constitution, his claims of a calculated scheme, his warnings about consolidation of power, standing armies, and more. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, January 17th, 2025. Let's kick it off here with this little introduction from Mike Meharry. Luther Martin of Maryland played a significant role at the Philadelphia Convention. From the outset, he championed a system that would respect the sovereignty of the states and advocated for a Bill of Rights. His underlying belief, Mike writes, was that federalism and state sovereignty were essential to preserving individual liberty, and that a centralized system would guarantee tyranny. Now, frustrated by the convention's direction, he wasn't one of these quiet guys there. He was very active. And the lack of support for these views, he left the convention on September 3rd. This is 2 weeks to the day, if my math is correct, I went to government school, so I struggle, before what we call Constitution Day. That's September 17th, 1787, the day that the convention wrapped up. So he left September 3rd with fellow delegate from Maryland, John Francis Mercer, and refused to sign the Constitution. Now, on November 29th, 1787, Martin gave a really long and sometimes meandering speech to the Maryland legislature. He was basically reporting back what went down, and he outlined his objections to the proposed Constitution and discussed what he thought were some of the kind of underhanded schemes that went on while he was there. As Mike Meharry points out, it was published after he gave that speech in installments as a series of essays called Genuine Information. It first was in the Baltimore, Maryland Gazette on December 28, 1787. That was the first one, and it ran all the way through February 8th, 1788. From there, it was reprinted in newspapers all over the place: Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina. It was even published later in pamphlet form in April, further expanding its reach. In other words, Luther Martin's views were printed, published, read all over the place. Now, he didn't necessarily influence too many people who were entrenched on the other side, but his positions and his arguments really became kind of a basis for what many of the anti-federalist positions were, and other people were followed as well. But anyways, as the ratification debates progressed, Mike writes, Martin's essays became an essential resource for anti-federalists, alarmed by consolidation and centralization of power in a unified national government. And Martin's primary issue here was state sovereignty. And Mike says state sovereignty was at the core of Martin's objections because he thought it would be wiped out, annihilated, or swallowed up by a centralized power. He argued that states are inherently sovereign and their governments are independent, and that makes them fundamentally different in function than a general or a federal government. And Martin explained it like this. He said, a federal government is formed by the states. You may have heard that old phrase, the states created the federal government, not the other way around. And that's what he said is a federal system. But he argued well, that's not what we're doing here. Anyways, a federal government, he said, is formed by the states, as states, that is, in their sovereign capacities, in the same manner as treaties and alliances are formed. So he saw it kind of as an alliance or treaty if you're going to have a federal system. And if you don't have that, then you don't have a federal system. So he described the different purposes of these various governments, states and federal. He said the federal government is to guard and protect the states and their rights and to regulate their common concerns. I know I can hear somebody out there saying states don't have rights, only individuals do. Well, absolutely correct if we're thinking of rights only in the modern sense of individual liberty, individual rights. But the founding generation often used various terms interchangeably, rights and powers, for example. That's one really prominent example, whether it was John Jay on the Federalist side, Luther Martin on the Anti-Federalist side. Really, we're talking about states and their reserved powers. Their right to act is, in essence, how they're putting it. And then he explained the states. He said the state governments are to watch over and protect the rights of the individual. The federal government is only supposed to be basically guarding and protecting the states. The states protect the individuals. That's the system of Luther Martin, or how he's describing a federal system. Protect the rights of the individual, whether rich or poor, or of moderate circumstances, and in which the democratic and aristocratic influence or principles are to be so blended, modified, and checked as to prevent oppression and injury. That's how he described it. Now, back to Mike Maharrey. He points out that he also viewed the move to ratify the Constitution through state conventions rather than state legislatures. So state conventions means popular choice versus state legislatures from the government, as a betrayal of the compact between the states under the Articles of Confederation. And Mike says because of this foundation, Luther Martin contended that the Constitution wasn't forming a federal government at all. If he's describing what he saw was the proper definition of a federal system, and he said, well, we're not doing that. And then on top of it, the ratification procedure isn't even doing that either. We don't have a federal government. Instead, we have something else. And he said the government we were forming was not in reality a federal, but a national government, not founded on the principles of the preservation, but the abolition or consolidation of all state governments. And he actually argued that there were only two purely federal features in the Constitution. He called them one, really, but one federal feature, but I think we can count them as two. One, the appointment of the senators by the states in their sovereign capacity. That is, by their legislatures. 17th Amendment got rid of that, of course. And then on top of it, the equality of suffrage in that branch. But Mike points out that despite these lone concessions to a federal system, Luther Martin asserted that the convention had overstepped its original purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, a system designed to operate through or on the states, not directly on individuals. In his view, the proposed Constitution instead established a national government that would directly govern citizens, effectively undoing the sovereignty of the states. Now, we don't even think of this at all. Most people don't think of this today. What do you mean? The federal government should only be acting on states, and the states are the ones who act on citizens? That doesn't cross anyone's mind. They think this is the way things are supposed to be. But Martin's arguing, well, it could be different. And this is how he described it. We appeared totally to have forgot the business for which we were sent. And he's taking the position that the Philadelphia Convention itself, even though there were very strong arguments on the other side, and we can maybe do another episode on this in the future, he's saying that they overstepped what they were authorized to do. He said, we appeared totally to have forgot the business for which we were sent and the situation of the country for which we were preparing our system. He said, we had not been sent to form a government over the inhabitants of America, considered as individuals, that as individuals, they were all subject to the respective state governments, which governments would still remain, though the federal government was dissolved. He said the system of government we were entrusted to prepare was a government over these 13 states, even if it was a stronger one than the previous system under the Articles of Confederation. That was the system that he felt that they were authorized to set up through amendments, however may be. Now, he went through several objections to any type of a national scheme. So he went through this whole process of explaining, like, look, this is not a federal system. It's a national one. Now, we have to understand that at the time, there were people, including many at the Philadelphia Convention, who actually wanted a consolidated system. There wasn't we'll go through the different factions in Philadelphia in a minute here. Well, a little bit more than that, but Luther Martin goes through those as well. But there were people who wanted that. So he's actually making the case to the Maryland legislature, like, look, this is a national system. Now, recognizing probably that there were people there who are like, okay, that's cool. He actually made the case that a national system would be terrible. And he started out with this. This continent is much too extensive for one national government, which should have sufficient power and energy to pervade and hold in obedience and subjection all its parts, consistent with the enjoyment and preservation of liberty. TLDR. One government to reign over a massive landmass, massive territory, and have the power it needs to have in order to do the stuff it needs to do. It's impossible, he's making the case, to also preserve liberty at the same time. And what he's really doing is building on the views of Montesquieu, what many in the founding generation called the celebrated Montesquieu. Both anti-federalists and federalists alike cited him all over the place. They just disagreed on how to read it or interpret his work, The Spirit of the Laws. But here's a little bit of what we know that Luther Martin is coming from. It is natural, this is from Montesquieu chapter 16, it is natural for a republic to have only a small territory, otherwise it cannot long subsist. And if the republic does not subsist, it generally turns into something problematic. It doesn't turn into just some kind of voluntarist free society at all. The argument was it was going to turn into some kind of a tyranny. And that was what had happened throughout history. In an extensive republic, wrote Montesquieu, there are men of large fortunes. These are two reasons why this goes down. The first one, and consequently of less moderation. There are trusts too considerable to be placed in any single subject. He has interests of his own. And this sounds pretty familiar. He soon begins to think that he may be happy and glorious by oppressing his fellow citizens, and that he may raise himself to grandeur on the ruins of his country. Now, the second issue, Montague said, in an extensive republic, the public good is sacrificed to 1,000 private views. It is subordinate to exceptions and depends on accidents. To me, that is a great description of a vast majority of federal welfare programs, the social safety net. So many different federal programs, laws, rules, regulations, acts, orders, and the like. This is a great description in my mind. On the other hand, Montesquieu said, in a small republic, the interest of the public is more obvious, better understood, and more within the reach of every citizen. Abuses have less extent, and of course, are less protected. So it doesn't even have as big of a territorial impact. So when you get a tyrant in a small republic, they're not impacting people on the other side of the landmass. So if we only had Washington, D.C. ruling over Washington, D.C., it wouldn't impact people in Montana or Texas or Wyoming or New York or California, whatever it may be. And that's one of the points about a republic and extensive territory. Now, Meharry points out that Martin pointed out that Montesquieu's theories were put into practice in colonial America. This was the system that they were used to. Everyone understood this stuff. And the people were used to a relatively localized system of government. Martin wrote that during the colonial people, they had been accustomed to have all their concerns transacted within a narrow circle, their colonial districts, and that allowed them to have access without much inconvenience when their business should require it. Now, Martin lamented that this was not the system that was proposed in Philadelphia. However, he said, a majority of the convention hastily and inconsiderately, without condescending to make a fair trial, in their great wisdom, decided that a kind of government, which a Montesquieu and a Price have declared the best calculated of any to preserve internal liberty and to enjoy external strength and security, and the only one by which a large continent can be connected and united consistently with the principles of liberty, was totally impracticable, and they acted accordingly. What's he saying there? Like, look, we all agree that Montesquieu and Price have really taught us the best system that can preserve liberty and give us external strength and security, can unite a large continent on the principles of liberty, but they said, nah, this is not going to work. So they acted accordingly and came up with something completely different. Now, I'm citing all kinds of stuff here, primarily Luther Martin's direct text, but also Mike Meharry's great article that we published this morning. I've got another episode I'm going to recommend here in just a little bit, but this will all be linked to in the show notes. We publish a blog post for every single episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley does an awesome and incredibly consistent job getting that organized. He has the show link, so it'll at the top of it, you'll get an overview of the episode, then you have the audio player and various podcast platforms we're on. Then we have a video player and other video platforms we're on. And then there's the show link section. And it's generally kind of in order of the stuff that I go through in the episode. That way you can read and learn more in context on your own time, because I'm just scratching the surface. I'm hoping this whets your appetite to, well, it's a lot of reading when it comes to Luther Martin, but it's really important stuff. And that'll be, Alan will get that organized and that'll be published. I'll get it published a couple of hours after this live stream is done, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Now let's get to this conspiracy at the Philadelphia Convention. Mike says that Luther Martin described 3 factions at the Philadelphia Convention, 2 of which conspired together to propose a system of great and undefined powers. Neither of them had a majority, and so they decided to kind of work together, find some common ground, and they proposed a system that was not really, it had a lot of power, but some of it wasn't even defined well. The first, he said, the first faction wanted to, quote, abolish and annihilate all state governments and to bring forward one general government over this extensive continent of a monarchical nature. He said there were very few people in this camp who openly avowed this sentiment. Now, we know Alexander Hamilton openly avowed that sentiment in a speech, I think it was June 18th, 1787 in Philadelphia. I may have the date wrong, but he specifically said, like, look, if the people were ready for it, we should abolish the state governments. In essence, get rid of them. They're pointless. We don't want a federal system. We want one national system. Now, Martin said this group was, quote, covertly, but he said that even though not everybody was super open about it like Hamilton was, he said there was still a considerable number who did not openly avow it, but still held the same position. He said this group was, quote, covertly endeavoring to carry into effect what they well knew openly and avowedly could not be accomplished. And that absolutely is exactly, Hamilton said this openly. He knew that this was the case in Philadelphia. I covered that, his plans for a total national consolidated system in an episode a couple of years ago. Alexander Hamilton's craziest plan. Here's the overview. He thought a national bank, implied powers, the whiskey tax, and redefining necessary as convenient was bad enough. Wait till you hear what Alexander Hamilton really wanted to do. I'll make sure that that's included in the notes so Alan Mosley can get it in the blog post for this episode. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. So the first group they were absolutely trying to have one centralized system. And Mike says Martin then described a second faction that wanted to restrain the state governments. So they wanted a more powerful centralized system. They saw the state governments as problematic. This is like James Madison, probably Edmund Randolph, and a number of other people. And they opposed a monarchical system, but they still hoped to empower their own states to the detriment of others. This is the large states will have more power over the small states. Instead, he said, they, quote, wished to establish such a system as would give their own states undue power and influence in the government over the other states. He gave an example, like he said, when we kick this thing off, basically a quorum in the House of Representatives will be 36. And then he named 3 states, one of which was Virginia. He said these 3 states are going to have 33 representatives. So if they all show up and the quorum is 36, you've got 3 states that are ruling over the rest. And that's why he did not like a system of unequal representation in Congress at all. I can maybe cover that in a future episode because we're going to discuss it in more detail in another article. Now, Martin said the third party, quote, was what I considered truly federal. So there was a group of people who wanted a federal system. There was a group of people who wanted a totally national system. And there was a group who wanted a lot more power, but somewhere in between. Now, Mike says, according to Martin, the faction hoping for the total abolition of state governments understood they were too weak in numbers and knew that, quote, the people of America would reject it if proposed to them. Hamilton and others, there weren't a lot of them like this, but they certainly existed. So Martin said, they basically collaborated. He said they joined their interest with that party who wished a system giving particular states the power and influence over the others, procuring in return mutual sacrifices from them. So they made deals and said, okay, well, we're not going to get all the power we want. You're not going to get the system that you want. These federal people are going to, people who want federalism, they're going to ruin it for all of us. So why don't we find some common ground and we're going to propose a system and we'll overwhelm their votes here in this convention and we'll present it like that. That's basically the argument that Luther Martin made about what went down at the Philadelphia Convention. So they were going to procure and return mutual sacrifices from the people who didn't want monarchy, but still wanted a lot of centralized power in giving the government. And how they did it? Great and undefined powers as to its legislative and executive, well knowing that by departing from a federal system, they paved the way for their favorite object, the destruction of the state governments and the introduction of monarchy. Whether monarchy through an elective system or not, an elective despotism is how people like Richard Henry Lee or Thomas Jefferson would have described it. But it doesn't matter. Basically, a centralized system and under an all-powerful kind of single dude with, even like Hamilton wanted. Check out that other episode if you want to get all the details on it. But this is what Luther Martin is explaining happened in Philadelphia from his own view since he was there. Now, going a little further here, one of the ways that they actually combined these two factions against the people who wanted federalism was in regarding federal power over the militia and a power to establish standing armies, even in times of peace. And he said, by the 8th section of the first article, so Article 1, Section 8, the Congress have also a power given them to raise and support armies without any limitation as to numbers, and without any restriction in time of peace. Now, he actually made an effort in Philadelphia, and he discussed this as well right around here, where he said, look, I proposed an amendment where we could at least restrict, I knew they weren't going to totally go for a ban on standing armies, so I at least tried to limit the amount that they could raise, the number of people, and that was totally rejected as well. He said, thus, sir, this plan of government, instead of guarding against a standing army, that engine of arbitrary power, which has so often and so successfully been used for the subversion of freedom, has, in its formation, given it an express and constitutional sanction, and hath provided for its introduction. Here, I'll go a little bit further here. He explains this amendment that he proposed. He said, nor could this be prevented. He tried. I took the sense of the convention on a proposition. Now, George Mason really also was on board with opposing this as well. I took the sense of the convention on a proposition by which the Congress should not have power in time of peace to keep embodied more than a certain number of regular troops, that number to be ascertained by what should be considered a respectable peace establishment. This proposition was rejected by a majority, it being their determination that the power of Congress to keep up a standing army, even in peace, should only be restrained by their will and pleasure. So he specifically said, this is problematic. And then he pointed to the fact that, look, I tried to stop it, but I couldn't find enough people on board to say we can't have a standing army at all. He would have gotten smoked on that vote. And then he really, really still tried to even make it less bad by proposing that amendment, and that got voted down as well. Mike Meharry writes, Martin noted that he took the sense of the convention and proposed it, it was rejected. I didn't realize, I guess I had that in my notes. So Meharry explained that in his article as well. Of course, that'll be linked to in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But tying in with the arguments against standing armies and the power to raise them in Congress, he was also concerned about congressional power over the militia at all. He said, as it now stands, the Congress will have, as it now stands, is a very important phrase on the anti-federalist side. A lot of people think that the Federalists were in favor of ratification, the anti-federalists were opposed, but a vast majority of the anti-federalists were opposed to the system as it now stands. This was them making the case that, hey, we could be on board with more power to regulate commerce, but we really, really need a bunch of amendments to make sure that it's clear what powers they have, and we shouldn't have these undefined powers, as Luther Martin was discussing as well. So as it now stands, the Congress will have the power, if they please, to march the whole militia of Maryland to the remotest part of the Union and keep them in service as long as they think proper, without being in any respect dependent upon the government of Maryland for this unlimited exercise of power over its citizens. Keep in mind, he doesn't have to explain it because everyone understood it. If we're talking about marching the militia, that means potentially marching all the able-bodied people, age 16 to 60, all able-bodied men, maybe everyone, all the people, depending on which founder discussing it. It was really not just a select group of people. So this is a very significant power that many of the anti-federalists were concerned about. And now, if you think about it as well, he wasn't actually warning, because no one was thinking this, at least that I'm not aware of. He wasn't warning that they would be marching the militia to another country across the ocean to occupy another land or to have some kind of offensive defensive measure in another country. His great concern was that they would use the militia in various parts of the continent, and that in and of itself was bad. I can't even imagine what he would say about how things are treated today. But going a little bit further, Mike says he warned that the combination of a standing army and the federal power over the militia, quote, ought to be considered the last coup de grace to state governments. And he called it the most convincing proof that the advocates of this system designed the destruction of the state governments. Basically, if you don't believe me of what happened in that secret conclave in Philadelphia, if you don't believe me and you're just mad at me for breaking a secrecy rule, well, look at what they put together. And if we analyze how this might play out, well, this should be enough proof to show that they want to destroy the system of federalism. Now, Martin also said, look, in this system, we give the general government every provision it could wish for. So all kinds of powers to do all kinds of stuff. And then we even invite it to subvert the liberties of the states and their citizens. Since we give them the right to increase and keep up a standing army as numerous as it would wish, and by placing the militia under its power, we enable it to leave the militia totally unorganized, totally undisciplined, and even to disarm them. If the federal government has the power to organize, discipline, and arm the militia, well, maybe they'll decide, as George Mason was concerned, to only arm and train and organize part of them. And therefore, the capital security of a free republic, the people themselves, will be disarmed. Sounds pretty familiar to me. Now, Luther Martin's genuine information really became a cornerstone of anti-federalist arguments, opposition against ratification. And I think a lot of his warnings still apply today. The big one is that liberty cannot survive in a centralized, consolidated, national system. Here's how Mike Meharry puts it. At the heart of his objections was the overwhelming power granted to the federal government at the expense of state sovereignty. He warned that the proposed constitution would lead to the annihilation of state authority, the rise of aristocracy, and the erosion of individual rights. Called it. Martin argued that these outcomes were no accident. Instead, he believed the centralization and nationalization of power were deliberate features of the proposed system, intentionally designed to concentrate authority in the hands of a few. For Martin, this was not just a theoretical flaw, but a direct threat to the balance of power that would safeguard liberty, or could safeguard liberty. And I think as we once again live under the largest government in history, similar to what, or more powerful in many ways, to what the founders and old revolutionaries fought a long, bloody war to secede from, maybe we have to realize that Luther Martin was onto something. He may not have been right on everything, but he was certainly onto something. And I think we should pay way more attention to his warnings. And so I've actually got a couple of other articles lined up, both in process, and at least one more episode covering his anti-federalist objections to ratification. The articles for sure will cover his critique of the impeachment power, the structure of both the House and the Senate, judicial overreach, and the big one, I'm definitely going to do an episode on this one, taxation, federal taxing power. He believed that the federal taxing power would and this is well before the 16th Amendment, would drain resources from both the states and individuals and pave the way for both economic dependence and total centralized power and oppression. Now, I don't think there's anything that helps us do this kind of work. The research, the articles, the videos, reaching and teaching more and more people about these essential foundational principles, about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both when government refuses to do so. That's 24/7, 365. Nothing helps us more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you support our work and you want to help us do more, please consider joining us today. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that's quickly devaluing, our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members is where you sign up for that. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. And if you prefer to make a one-time contribution, or you're already a member and you want to kick in a little bit more, no pressure, but I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member, or making a one-time donation over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Thank you so much for any consideration you can give to helping us out today. You can also hit the like button, subscribe, get notifications. The more watch time you have on YouTube or the mainstream video platforms, the more likely the algorithm is going to show us to more people. Comments in the archive, reviews on the podcast platform, all that stuff helps out a great deal. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. I should let you know I'm going to be off. I'm not going to do a show on Monday, but I'll be back to my regular schedule Wednesday and Friday of next week. So I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.